What happens when the crown no longer shines? When a king, praised, loved, and worshipped, begins to crack under the weight of secrets too heavy to bear? Jerry, the King Lawler, once a symbol of wrestling royalty, carried more than just championships on his shoulders. For decades, fans saw the loud suits, the boisterous commentary, the iconic matches, but few knew what simmered beneath. In the glittering world of pro wrestling, it's easy to forget that behind every character is a real person. And sometimes those people carry shadows that not even the spotlight can erase. It was December 1993 in Louisville, Kentucky, when Lawler's kingdom faced its first major tremor. Two teenage girls stepped forward, and their words would shake the wrestling world to its core. According to police reports, the two gave eerily similar statements. They claimed an incident occurred in Lawler's hotel room. The wrestling legend at first denied that the teens were ever there, but later changed his story. Yes, they had stopped by, he admitted, but only to use the phone. The room suddenly didn't feel like a safe haven of fame anymore. It felt like the beginning of a scandal. As weeks passed, Lawler was removed from WWF programming, a shocking move that sparked more questions than answers. Wrestling fans watched in confusion. Where was the king? Why had he vanished? Behind the scenes, a legal storm was brewing. In 2018, long after the dust had settled publicly, journalist David Bixenspan unearthed a handwritten letter from Lawler. It had been buried in official police records, only discovered after a public request. In that letter, Lawler didn't just deny the allegations, he went on the offensive, attacking the teenage girl's character in words so harsh they'd be considered unforgivable by today's standards. The justice system made its decision. Rather than pursue a lengthy trial, prosecutors agreed to a plea deal. In February 1994, Lawler pleaded guilty to harassing a witness, not for the incident itself, but for allegedly contacting a relative of one of the girls during the investigation. He paid a $500 fine, no jail time, no lengthy sentence, just a shadow that followed him back into the ring. And that's exactly what happened. Lawler returned to WWF television as if nothing had occurred. No statements, no apologies, silence louder than any bell ever rung in the squared circle. Years passed, and the case faded from public memory. But in 2017, the past flickered back into view. Lawler retweeted a post referencing the incident. He offered no comment, no denial, no defense, just a retweet. Fans noticed, some remembered, others were stunned to learn of something they'd never heard before. And once again, questions were raised. Was this justice? Was it accountability? Or had the king simply slipped through the cracks of a system that often protects its most famous faces? But controversy doesn't always walk alone. It often brings company. Enter Eddie Gilbert, a brilliant wrestling mind and once a trusted figure in Memphis wrestling. He had the creativity, the passion, the drive. For a while, he was even the booker in the Continental Wrestling Association, a position of power that shaped storylines and outcomes. But Gilbert's rise was short-lived. Jerry Lawler reportedly took the booking job away from him, claiming inconsistency, a decision that many believed wasn't about talent, but control. Gilbert's departure was followed by bitterness that ran deep. His younger brother, Doug Gilbert, never forgot. He stayed in the wrestling world and simmered with resentment. And in October 1999, during a live broadcast of Power Pro Wrestling, that anger finally exploded. Doug went off script. Live on television, he accused Lawler's son, Brian Christopher, of riding his father's coattails. He called out Power Pro Wrestling's booker, and then he did the unthinkable. He referenced the 1993 allegations against Lawler. The screen went black as the show cut to commercial. Within days, Doug Gilbert was fired. Backstage politics and personal grudges weren't rare in the wrestling business. But what made these events so haunting wasn't just what was said, it was what wasn't. Lawler never responded publicly to Doug's live tirade. No lawsuits, no clarifications, just silence, as if the broadcast had never happened. Fans who saw it live knew they'd witnessed something real, not part of a script, not part of a show, just raw, unfiltered truth broadcast to thousands before being erased like a forbidden memory. But Lawler's list of conflicts wasn't limited to the Gilberts. In 1988, a bold attempt was made to challenge the growing dominance of Vince McMahon's WWF. The Continental Wrestling Association and World Class Championship Wrestling joined forces for a joint pay-per-view, Super Clash 3. Lawler faced Kerry Von Erich in a unification match that promised fireworks, but delivered confusion. A bloody match ended suddenly, with Lawler declared the winner. Fans felt cheated. Behind the curtain, Lawler claimed Kerry showed up unfit to wrestle, and worse, he wasn't even paid fairly. He refused to return to Awe events. Awe in turn stripped him of the title. A pattern was emerging. Lawler the victim, Lawler the rebel, Lawler the king who refused to bow. Was he a man fighting injustice, or one manipulating the game on his own terms? The lines were beginning to blur, and those around him started to question whether Lawler's loyalty was ever to the fans, or only to himself. And then came the broken jaw, the backstage brawl with Paul Heyman. Another story, another scar. But we'll get to that. Because what happened next wasn't about championships or booking disputes. It was about love, betrayal, and a decision that would cost Lawler everything, if only for a little while. They say love can build empires, or burn them down. For Jerry Lawler, love didn't just walk into his life. It strutted in with glitter, ambition, and a dream of stardom. Her name was Stacey Carter, but the world would come to know her as Miss Kitty. She wasn't a trained wrestler. She didn't grow up in the business. But when Lawler, the king of Memphis, fell for a local bank teller, he opened the doors of the wrestling world for her. What followed was a whirlwind that would change both of their careers and nearly end Lawler's forever. Stacey quickly rose through the ranks, first appearing on WWF television as a valet and later transforming into the Cat, a bold and controversial character who thrived during the risque Attitude Era. She played her part perfectly, flamboyant, fearless, and willing to push the limits. But what the audience didn't see was how much backstage friction she was causing. According to Jim Ross, the head of talent relations at the time, Stacey clashed with the creative team often. And when egos and television ratings collide, there are always consequences waiting in the shadows. Eventually, word of the tension reached Vince McMahon himself. The decision was made behind closed doors, swift and final. Stacey Carter was let go, fired, just like that. But what came next shocked the industry. Jerry Lawler, WWF legend, beloved commentator, and trusted figure, walked out of the company on the very same day. Publicly, he declared he could not and would not work for a company that treated his wife so poorly. To some, it was loyalty. To others, it was recklessness. Either way, the king had just abandoned his throne. Their marriage, once a public mystery, began to unravel in private. By the end of that same year, Lawler and Carter had separated. And just as quickly as he had walked away, Lawler returned to WWE in November 2001, as if nothing had happened. No explanation, no fanfare, just back at the commentary table, cracking jokes and calling matches. Stacey Carter, however, would never be seen in WWE again. Her name faded, her legacy blurred, as if the company had simply erased her from history. But Lawler's past never stayed buried for long. Around that same era, another old rivalry came back to haunt him, this time with the loud and brash Paul Heyman. Their beef went back to the 1980s when Heyman was just starting as a manager in Memphis. Lawler claimed he had booked Heyman in a dramatic scaffold match to close a major storyline. But Heyman, terrified of heights, refused to climb up. It led to a violent altercation backstage, one that allegedly ended with Lawler punching Heyman and breaking his jaw, a punch that left a scar on both their careers. Their animosity simmered for years. So when ECW invaded WWF in 1997, the fireworks weren't just scripted, they were personal. On live television, Lawler used the opportunity to bury ECW and mock Heyman at every turn. But Heyman, now at the commentary table, fired back with a venom of his own. He called Lawler a relic, a man stuck in the past, clinging to a version of wrestling that the world had already outgrown. The tension was palpable. Fans loved it. But few realized they weren't watching characters. They were watching two men with a very real score to settle. By the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Jerry Lawler's role had shifted. He was no longer the fiery wrestler in the ring. He had become the voice of WWE, an entertainer, a comedian, and the king of one-liners. His constant shouts of puppies whenever a female wrestler appeared became a strange staple of the Attitude Era. But times were changing. the jokes started aging. The world moved forward, and not everyone kept up. In 2017, the Me Too movement changed the landscape of every industry, including wrestling. That same year, Lawler was hosting his podcast Dinner with the King when the topic of sexual misconduct came up. Instead of treading carefully, Lawler leaned in. He claimed that soon, anyone who had ever flirted might be a target. He lamented the loss of bra and panties matches in WWE. He even complained about having to call female wrestlers women instead of divas. The comments once tolerated as edgy were now seen as outdated and offensive. The backlash was swift. Fans called out Lawler for being tone-deaf and out of touch. The podcast episodes were quietly removed from circulation. And though WWE never made an official statement, it was clear the era of unchecked commentary was over. Lawler had built his brand on nostalgia and charm, but now that charm was beginning to sour. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't spiral further, came the most dangerous scandal yet. In 2016, police responded to a 911 hang-up at Lawler's Memphis home. What they found would lead to both him and his fiancée, Lauren McBride, being arrested for domestic assault. She claimed Lawler hit her and shoved her into a stove. He claimed she was drunk, threw a candle, scratched his face, and even brought a gun into the room threatening suicide. With no clear aggressor, both were charged. WWE suspended Lawler immediately, not waiting for the facts. This wasn't a storyline. This was real-life unraveling in public. The charges were later dropped, and Lawler was reinstated by WWE. But something had changed. The once unshakable image of Jerry Lawler had taken another hit. Fans who had admired his loyalty, his charisma, his old-school grit, now wondered who he really was behind the curtain. And as more pieces of his past came to light, the question wasn't whether the King had ruled wrestling, but what price he had paid to stay on the throne. But the crown wasn't done slipping just yet. Because beneath all the scandals, betrayals, and bruises, one truth still lingered in the air. Something deeper, something darker, and something that had been overlooked for far too long. Every kingdom, no matter how grand, faces the storm of reckoning. Jerry Lawler's legacy, once carved in gold and glory, now resembled something more fragile. Every scandal, every silence, every unspoken truth had slowly chipped away at his crown. By now, he wasn't just the king of wrestling. He was a puzzle of contradictions, a man adored in the ring, but questioned outside of it. And just when it seemed like the shadows couldn't grow darker, a final piece of his story came crashing into view, one that demanded a truth the world was still unsure it wanted to hear. The strange thing about Jerry Lawler is that for every mistake, every allegation, he always returned. Like a ghost in the machine, he reappeared at commentary tables, on reunion shows, podcasts, and panels. Fans forgave, or forgot, or simply didn't know. But history, unlike wrestling, doesn't follow a script. And when you look at Lawler's timeline, a pattern emerges. Allegations dismissed, charges dropped, stories buried under comeback matches and nostalgia pops. Was it resilience or privilege wrapped in fame? And then came the generational twist, the tale of his son, Brian Christopher. Known to fans as Grandmaster Sexay, Brian carved his own path in WWE, dancing and smiling through the Attitude Era. But behind the funky gimmicks was a man deeply troubled. His relationship with Lawler was always complicated. For years, WWE kept their family connection hidden, refusing to acknowledge the bloodline. And when it was finally made public, the bond seemed more professional than personal. Two men in the same business, walking separate emotional paths. But Brian's life unraveled. Substance abuse, multiple arrests, and a crumbling reputation led to his slow fall from grace. In July 2018, he was arrested again. Days later, he was found hanging in his jail cell. He died in the hospital, with his father by his side. The news shook the wrestling world. Fans mourned. Wrestlers wept. Jerry Lawler stood by the coffin, a man who had lived through the rise and fall of a son he perhaps never truly understood. And for the first time, the King looked human. Lawler sued the jail, alleging negligence. He demanded answers, justice, closure. But some questioned whether that same fire had ever been shown for the people who accused him years before. It was an uncomfortable irony. Lawler, once accused, now standing as the grieving father of a man who had his own demons. The cycle of pain had come full circle, and this time It wasn't about wrestling. It was about loss. Deep, irreversible loss. Still, Lawler moved forward. He returned to commentary, made appearances, signed autographs, smiled for photos. Time had weathered his face, but not his presence. He was still beloved in Memphis, still called the King. But for a growing number of fans, especially the younger generation, his legacy was no longer untouchable. Questions floated through the community. Was he misunderstood or masterfully manipulative? Was he unfairly targeted, or did he just know how to escape? Because here's the thing. In professional wrestling, character is everything. But in life, character is what remains when the lights go out and the cameras stop rolling. Lawler built an empire on charisma and controversy, but those closest to him, Doug Gilbert, Paul Heyman, Stacey Carter, even his own son, were often left behind, broken, or silenced. That's not just coincidence, that's consequence. And yet, fans still chant his name. They wear his merch. They defend him online. Wrestling is a business built on heroes and villains, but Lawler blurred that line like few others. To some, he's still the wisecracking commentator, the defender of old-school wrestling, the king of Memphis. To others, he's the embodiment of a system that protects its legends, no matter the cost. So now, we're left with a complicated legacy, one that doesn't fit neatly into a Hall of Fame package or a tribute montage. It's messy, painful, real. The man who once reigned over Memphis wrestling now stands at the crossroads of admiration and accountability. His crown may still glitter under the arena lights, but beneath it lies a trail of questions, many of which may never be fully answered. And perhaps that's the real story. Not the rise, not even the fall, but the haunting silence in between. The unanswered questions, the redacted reports, the interviews never given, the people left in the margins while one man remained in the spotlight. Because in the end, was Jerry Lawler a king who protected his kingdom, or a king who ruled over ashes, convincing everyone the fire never happened?